All right. So, as is typically my habit, I will be referencing bits, words, and things. So if you want to have your Pew Bibles open to look at it, you don't have to. Or if you brought your own Bibles, the Pew Bible, it's 894. If it's your own, it's Acts chapter 10. A brief introduction before I get going. I like the narrative lectionary. I like the style of how it runs us through. I do not understand how they decided to put the lines of where to start and stop readings. Because the punchline of this piece is in the middle of that section we jump over. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but I just wanted to throw that out there, that the really fun bits are kind of in the middle. So we get the story, but not some of that. So if I reference something that you don't remember hearing, I'm sorry in advance. So last week, we talked about the Great Commission, right? Go forth and make disciples, and we had a whole bunch of baptisms, which are really beautiful. So at this point now in the story, Jesus is kind of out of the picture. He's ascended. And the disciples are going around trying to figure out what to do next. Because Jesus is really good at not giving clear instructions, all right? He is not the one doing technical writing for instruction manuals. That's just not his way of doing things. So they're left wondering what happens next. And this story doesn't even open up with one of them. It actually opens up with this guy named Cornelius. Now Cornelius, it says, is in the Roman military. He's a centurion. That means he's in charge of 80 men. In Latin, century means 100. But a century of soldiers is only 80 people. I don't know why. Don't ask me to make sense of Roman counting systems. But so he is a leader of this group of 80 men, and it specifies that he's from the Italian division, which means that although he's in sort of this Easter section of the empire, he's actually from the peninsula of Italy itself. He is a Roman. Not a Gaul from up in France or something, and not part of the Nubian section down on the northwest of Africa. He is a Roman. But it describes him really, really favorably. It says that he's a devout man, and he fears God, that he gives alms and prays. Luke, the same guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke, wrote Acts. And compared to the other gospel writers, Luke really likes to make people look good. In Mark and in Matthew and in John, the disciples are kind of idiots a lot of the time. They just have no grasp of what's going on. Luke gives them a lot more benefit of the doubt than anyone else. So when I read this, I have full confidence that this guy was probably a really good guy. But take with a grain of salt exactly how much praise Luke is throwing on him for a second. Because there's one phrase in particular of interest here, and that's God-fearing. While Romans certainly used that to refer to their own sort of devout people, fearing their pantheon of gods, for Jewish people at the time, that was specifically a term for someone who was considering conversion to Judaism or working their way into becoming Jewish, or occasionally it was a way to label Jewish sympathizers in the Roman military. So we don't really know if he was super interested in becoming Jewish, or if he was just someone who thought that the Romans were not treating them very well and was sort of sympathetic to their cause. So somewhere in that continuum. At any rate, he is not the most hated Roman, probably, in the Roman military. But he lives in this fort in Caesarea, and an angel comes to him. I love the fact that there is no real explanation given. It's not that he asks for something, there isn't a problem here to be solved or anything. He's just there, and this angel comes, and the angel says, God has heard you. And it's fun to me that the angel only specifies 2 of the 4 things that Luke gave him. He says, because of your alms and your prayers. Apparently, not because of his devotion or God-fearingness. God is at this point mostly concerned with his willingness to help the poor and his willingness to spend time in prayer. And the angel says, send for this guy named Peter, well, Simon, who also goes by Peter, because everyone has multiple names just to make things fun. All right, why? Never explains, but he takes a couple of his slaves and one of his other soldiers in his group and sends them away to pick up Peter, for whatever reason. Now Peter is hanging out with this other guy named Simon, not known as Peter, it doesn't really go into depth as to what he's doing there, but he has this vision, right, where this big sheet comes down with all these critters on it. Literally in Greek it says, everything with 4 legs, which is weird, but then it specifies reptiles, which mostly have 4 legs except snakes, so it's kind of goofy. At any rate, all this sheet comes down with all, yeah, I know, right? I'm shaking my head as I'm trying to read through these too. Like, do these mean specific things? Well, sort of, but not really. So the sheet comes down with all this stuff on it, and he hears God tell him, kill and eat. And Peter's like, don't you test me anymore, all right? I already passed this part. I don't eat this stuff because I uphold the Jewish dietary restrictions. He's a good Jew. He's a reasonably good Jew for the time. He doesn't eat those things. And God gives him this beautiful phrase, which doesn't translate into English, but they have to do it somehow. So they go, do not call, what I have called clean, do not call unclean. It's hard to relate this because cleanliness and uncleanliness is such a huge thing in the ancient world. Like whether or not something was clean, whether it was appropriate to be in the presence of God or in the presence of the community or something, there are all kinds of rules about what counts as clean and what doesn't. And if you want to test that theory, read through everything like end of Exodus up through Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, and you will see how often whether or not something is clean or unclean. So here God's telling him, if God is looked at as the inspiration of the Pentateuch, God said this stuff is unclean. And now God is telling him, hey, don't call this stuff unclean. But why? So he finishes this vision, and Luke puts it really nicely that he's pondering on it a little bit. Not like the other authors who would say he didn't understand it at all. Luke is like he was pondering on it, he was thinking about it. And then the centurion's men show up and invite him. Why? They never say because they don't know. Peter decides to go with. Why? He doesn't know. So no one really knows what's going on at this point. There's a whole bunch of confusion. And then we get to that part where they cut out. Like they travel, right? They travel from where they're at to the centurion's house. And they get there, and it's not just like the centurion and these 3 other guys that Peter's talking to at that end speech. It's his whole household, okay? And he comes in and basically gives this, real brief rundown of the gospel story about who Jesus is. And here's this beautiful line, though, before he starts. Verse 28. This is the punchline. Well, that makes it sound like a joke. This is like the core point right here in verse 28. You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. Jew or Gentile. So, every historical language has this pair of words. It's not really a pair. They have this specific word. Some languages have 2, like Greek. For anyone that doesn't belong to my group. So for the Jews, anyone who isn't Jewish is goyim, Gentile, right? And in Greek, they have 2 words. There's ethni, where we get the word ethnic from, which means nations. It means anyone who's not part of my group. They also have barbar, where we get the word barbarian from, which is someone who is not only not part of my group, but doesn't speak Greek. So like Greek actually has layers of otherness. But Peter here comes to this house, which is against all the rules of his tradition, of his texts. And he says, God has shown me that none of these others are unclean. That I can't call them, it says it twice, right? Profane or unclean. One of those words, kini, is common, right? Think of like a public bathroom. That's kini, that's unclean, right? The bathroom at the gas station in the middle of the night, that's kini, common. It's a word used for things that are literally never can be clean often. Like it's something that is by its nature going to be kind of iffy. And then the other word that he uses is akatho, which means, once again, we don't have it. Katho is to wash something, to make something clean, right? Like it's to clean it as a verb, not specifically to wash it, but to make something clean. And then you put an A in front of it, just like in English, that means to not that, right? So I can't call anything common, profane, dirty, and I can't call anything unwashed, any people. And that is a really big sweeping term, isn't it, right? Because that goes from Jesus' mission being for these people, and maybe this like little side chunk that wants to be part of that people, to literally being every human being, because all of the rules about what can come to God and what can't are off the table. Right? And Matthew has this thing about, I didn't come to get rid of the law, but to fulfill it. Well, if it's fulfilled, you still don't have to worry about it, do you? That box is checked for all people, according to Luke in this passage. That's why we baptize babies, right? The point of baptizing isn't to make them clean, because God has already said they're clean. We're not accomplishing something. It is not a work that saves us. We are in baptism, like we did last week, recognizing that God has made them clean. It is our recognition of that divine event. And whether something or not happens there that deals with the cleaning process, I don't know. In the ancient church, baptism is really strongly related to the coming of the Holy Spirit. It's not the point where they can necessarily come before God, it's the point at which God comes into them in a different way. And you know what's really funny about this? Is that happens before they get baptized. So even these like really early rules about how things are supposed to happen, right? He's not supposed to go there, but he goes there. Because he's not supposed to eat these things, but God told him to. Because he was sent for by a Roman centurion who really shouldn't want anything to do with him in the first place. He breaks all these rules to get there and tells them about Jesus. Doesn't say, so make sure you follow him. So make sure, he doesn't tell them to do anything. And suddenly the Spirit's there. Right? So even this rule of they come and we go through this period of instruction, they figure out what they're getting themselves into, and then we baptize them. Like even that process that they were sort of trying to work out, boom, that's gone. It doesn't work that way. This is like a whole chapter dedicated to God saying, it doesn't work that way. And that's either really freeing or really terrifying. Because we like things working a certain way. Like, boxes are really comfortable. And sometimes they're important, don't get me wrong. Right? It is important to know what you can eat and what is poisonous. Right? It's good when the trains show up on time, all right? There is no opposition here to the concept of rules. But the point is that those rules serve a purpose. And when they fail to serve that purpose, when they fail to bring people in to that mission, when they fail to help people be loved, to know their salvation, when they fail to encourage us to connect and to assist, then they're not doing what they were meant to do. They're tools for a purpose. And this is God saying, we've been misusing those tools. Let's try So these people, these Gentiles, these Romans, not just a Roman who's in part of the army that is oppressing this people, they're invited too. And God gives them the Spirit, so Peter is like, well, I gotta baptize them, because why not? They have a seat at the table. So last week we talked about baptism. This week we're having communion around the table. And in communion, everyone is welcome because no one is unclean or profane. Anyone who wants to have a seat at the table gets a seat because Jesus is the host of that table, and Jesus does not discern between categories of people. Jesus wants us all to know that we are present, to know that we are loved. Everybody. That is why the church Protestant churches at least, have the two sacraments. Baptism, to recognize that everyone is clean and can come before God, and communion, so that we can take a moment to actually sit at Jesus' table together and experience that commonality as one. Amen.